Temperature checks, probably the most popular right now. If anybody out there has gone online to try to purchase one of those infrared thermometers, number one, they're hard to find. And number two, they're kind of expensive. I bought one because in drug testing, we're letting general public walk in. And so probably a month into this whole thing, so somewhere around middle of April, I went online and found one for $50. And a month later, we are opening, our other offices. I went online, it was hard to find, and I paid, the cheapest I could find was like $75. So I think they're becoming, supply is ramping up, and it's now able to meet with the demand. But they're still not that cheap. But you have permission again by the EEOC. You have the green light to do temperature checks. All right, so just a couple of thoughts and some guidelines and regulations. So what constitutes a fever? So the CDC says if it's 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, you have a fever. Okay, so that's kind of your mark, 100.4 degrees. Who should take the temperature? So the best practice would be for employees who are trained nurses or medical professionals that are on site. If that's not available, then certainly you want to provide proper training on how to take temperatures. And the reason I say that, inside of those thermometers that you buy, you'll have manufacturer instructions. Those product inserts are actually very important, and you have to read them and make sure you understand, how it works. If you're like me, I like to just rip open electronics and figure it out. You can't do that with this. This is too serious. You got to make sure you know how it's operating. And if you don't have a trained professional, then you ought to put in one of your managers, someone at the managerial level or higher, that can take these temperatures. You don't want to just pluck anyone out of the crowd and say, this is going to be your job today. Okay. There are some companies out there in Mount Airy that are offering this as a service. So there are different ways to go about doing it. There are a lot of furloughed nurses out there. You could potentially hire a nurse to come in and help take these temperatures. So a lot of ways to do it. So what equipment should you use? Obviously, best practice is anything that is zero contact. That's why the infrared are so popular. I dropped my father at the doctor's office yesterday, and they're outside using one of the under your tongue thermometers. I found that to be interesting. But for businesses, I think the best practice is going to be using the non-contact type of thermometers, the infrareds. Some things to consider when you're setting this up. Can you add some additional shifts? That way it reduces the number of employees trying to converge at one time. Or could you set up some type of staggered shifts where folks come in over a period of time, instead of saying, all right, 8 o'clock, everybody report, and then you have a long line while you're going through and doing all the temperature checks. So you want to try to spread that out. You also want to create corridors. If you've ever been into Walmart in the past 2 months, it kind of cracks me up because you have these, arrows telling you which way to go, and nobody pays attention to it. I feel like I might be the only one. Anybody else not go? It seems like everybody goes against the grain. But you want to create corridors where you have an entrance way and an exit way, and you don't want to have people crossing each other. Okay, so that's if that's possible at your establishment, then that's what you want to try to do. Maybe have multiple entryways, okay? And consider putting down the old tape on the floor. It's kind of neat. I mean, everywhere you go, there's little spots, markers, circles, X's, crosses, lines, everywhere. But that's something you have to consider and you need to enforce. We're learning more and more about this, that social distancing is really helping. All right, some things to consider. Okay, here's some questions. If an employer wants to take workers' temperatures, should they pay employees that are sent home for high temperatures to limit any legal risk? I think it's one of the best questions. Employers should also consider what they do if employees refuse to have their temperatures taken. Would employers send these home without pay? Okay. Taking someone's temperature is considered a medical evaluation. Okay. So should you write down the number? I've been told if you write down the number, it becomes if you write down 97.8, it immediately becomes a medical record. Okay. One of the ways that might help against conflicting with ADA is put down yes or no. Do you have a fever? Yes or no? True or false? There's ways to record without actually writing down their temperature. Okay. Should an employer require a doctor's note or some other form that the employee is fit and able to return to duty? I hear stories of that happening. I hear stories of that not happening. These are just things you need to at least discuss with your managers, your boards, about what are we going to do when this happens? Because you're going to get somebody that says, well, I'm not letting you take my temperature. Well, if that's your requirement, what's your policy on it then? Okay. Any questions so far? How are we doing? Doing good? All right, some other guidance that the EEOC has put out. An employer may take an applicant's temperature as part of a post-offer pre-employment medical examination. Okay, they have stated that's okay to do. An employer may also screen applicants for symptoms of COVID-19 after making the conditional job offer. Okay. So now that you've hired them, now you can screen for their symptoms. An employer may delay the start of an applicant who has COVID-19 or symptoms associated with it. Okay, so you can tell an employee, hey, you've got to give it. We're going to start you, but it's going to be in 10 days, 14 days. An employer may withdraw a job offer when it needs the applicant to start immediately, but the individual has COVID-19 or symptoms of it. Okay. Those are interesting guidelines that they put out, and I'm glad that they did. It'll help folks when they have to make these decisions, because we're now starting to see people actually hiring people, new. And if you come down with this, you certainly don't want them in your place of business or in general public that need to go home and quarantine. Okay, the big one, COVID-19 testing in the workplace. So regular testing for workers, that really could help with this whole process and keep the spread at a minimum. But this whole testing, COVID-19, is very tricky, and we're learning more and more every day, and different types of tests are coming out. So what I wanted to do in this is kind of break down the two different types of testing, the big ones. You've got molecular and serological, and then we'll talk about them. Certainly, I can't cover the whole gamut of this in this time period. So please, if this is something that you are interested in, I would be very happy to talk to you about it. I want to share. We have an antibody test. We have received FDA authorization. We received our EUA. So we have a solid product at this point in time. It's gotten great reviews already. We've been selling it under the guidelines of our preliminary EUA, but now we have our EUA authorization letter, which is great. And there's another company in town, Gates Pharmacy. We are working with them to put together a package to help folks with this antibody testing. Gates Pharmacy is CLIA waived, and that's a huge step in this. So to have a product that is authorized by the FDA and being performed by a CLIA-waived laboratory, which Gates Pharmacy has the authorization for that, the certificate, there's a great opportunity for companies that are interested in this. I'm sorry for the pitch, but I wanted to get that out because it's important to know the truth, and that there are solid options here. All right, so serology or antibody testing. This is essentially a blood test, and you prick the finger, kind of like a diabetes test. You get a little drop of blood, you put it into the test kit, you add the buffer, and you get results in a couple of minutes. It's a rapid antibody testing. Our particular test, and this is for any test that does IgM or IgG. Most do IgG, but we have a test that does IgM and IgG. A positive IgM indicates that you may still be infected or just recently recovered. So the IgM antibody comes into play within 3 to 5 days of you having symptoms and signs of the infection. And once that is detected, you could potentially still be shedding the virus. So obviously you want to go get the next test we'll talk about. IgG, if you're positive for IgG, what that typically says is, hey, you've had the virus. You're not necessarily shedding it anymore. You've had it. And the IgG will stay in your body much longer than the IgM. The IgM is essentially 7 to 10 days that it might stay in your body, and that's all still being figured out with this particular virus. The IgG shows up anywhere from 7 to 10 up to 20 days after the signs and symptoms of the virus. I know everybody wants to hear them say the word immunity. We can't say that right now. There's just not enough scientific evidence. But we'll see what happens as more evidence comes along and we're able to test more people. The other type of test is the viral or molecular test. That's the one with the swab into your brain, and they test for whether you actually have the virus currently. It is, obviously way more involved in the testing process. They are developing some instant versions of that. From a science standpoint, I just don't think it's there yet. The home kits are actually lab-based kits. They're just sent to you by your physician, and you swab your mouth, package it, and ship it to LabCorp. They're the only ones that have it right now. So if you're positive for a viral test, it means you are actively infected with the coronavirus, the COVID-19 version. A negative result with the molecular test means that the virus that causes COVID-19 was not found in that sample. Doesn't mean you might not have it the next day. That's what's so tricky about this whole test. Even with the viral testing, you could be tested today and then start coming down with this the next day, or pick it up the next day. It's a very complicated situation. All right, so those are the two big differences. All right, so the antibody testing, that's kind of what we want to focus on here. If you test positive for the antibodies, again, that it shows that you likely were resulted from an infection with the SARS-CoV-2 or possibly a related coronavirus. It's unclear if the antibodies can provide immunity, like we talked about. I know it's what a lot of people want to believe, and I'm one of them. I hope it will get to that. We're just not able to say that yet. If you have no symptoms, you likely don't have an active infection, but you should always follow up with a viral test. So if you're positive for IgM or IgG, you should always consult your physician and go get a viral test. It's just the right thing to do. If you have symptoms and meet other guidelines for testing, you would need the viral testing. And it's possible you might test positive for antibodies and you might not have or have ever had the symptoms of COVID-19. That's because you're asymptomatic. And really that's where the value of this test comes in, because people just don't know if they're sick or not. and they come into the workplace